Imagine a woman in silk corseted, powdered gliding down the halls of a Parisian mansion. Her smile is demure, her voice like velvet soaked in rosewater. She kisses her father's cheek. The next day, he's dead. This is not a murder mystery. This is not a romantic tragedy. This is filth pure, rotting, perfumed, filth wearing the face of nobility. Madame de Brinvilliers was not simply a killer. She was a daughter, a lover, a socialite, and perhaps most terrifyingly, a reflection of her times. In an age where everything smelled of incense and sewage, she became the embodiment of moral decay, hiding behind powdered faces and perfumed gloves. In this video, we won't just tell her story. We'll take you behind the satin curtains, into the stink of 17th century privilege, depravity, and poison. She was born into satin and sin. Marie-Madeleine de Brinvilliers, later infamous as Madame de Brinvilliers, entered the world in 1630s Parisian era when the city smelled of feces, fire, smoke, and floral water, often all at once. Her father, Antoine Drouot d'Aubray, was a respected magistrate with a talent for legal brutality and political climbing. Her family's Hotel Particulier, nestled not far from the Rue Saint-Honore, was a strange kind of palace. Marble floors coated in soot, chamber pots rarely emptied, servants reeking of sweat and lye, and rooms doused in perfume not to charm, but to mask decay. It was a home dressed in opulence, stitched together with filth. Every object glittered, but carried the weight of grime underneath tapestries covering mildew-eaten walls. Carved wood, harboring colonies of mites, and powdered wigs shedding lice like dandruff. Marie-Madeleine grew up breathing this equal parts privilege and putrefaction. She was raised to be a lady, to write verse in impeccable script, to play the harpsichord, and most importantly, to suppress her thoughts beneath layers of etiquette. Her nursemaids whispered secrets of the street while rubbing lavender onto her wrists. Her tutors quoted saints while glancing too long at her adolescent body. Nothing was ever clean. Not the water, not the morals, not the silk-clad men who sipped claret beside her mother. Yet Marie-Madeleine learned early to smile through the stink, to curtsy through the corruption, and to survive through stillness. Even as she bathed in goat milk and honey, the filth clung to her unseen, unspoken, but always there. As a child, she learned more from the rot in the walls than the sermons in church. Her father, for all his grandeur, was cruel in precise ways. Not a monster. Not a madman, but a calculating enforcer of power who believed discipline was a form of love, and that daughters were investments to be paraded and married off. His punishments were quiet and suffocating. He once made Marie-Madeleine kneel for hours on salt crystals for speaking over a guest. When she bled, she smiled. When she sobbed, she apologized. From him, she learned silence. From her mother, who did nothing, she learned complicity. The mansion became her prison, gilded and guarded, where chandeliers gleamed while bedbugs bit beneath velvet canopies. Her early adolescence blurred with strange rituals and stranger visitors. There were men who visited her father for legal advice, but left trails of cologne, wine breath, and whispers behind. One guest in particular, a cousin twice removed, brought her licorice, kissed her hand, and left a stain on her pillow that nobody could explain. The household's idea of hygiene was ceremonial. A weekly bath if you were lucky, but always with the windows closed to avoid bad air, which only sealed in the stench. The chamber pots overflowed by morning. The servants wiped themselves with hay or dirty rags. The dogs were never let outside. The kitchen reeked of meat and mold. The cook once lost 3 fingers to gangrene, but continued to prepare roast duck. This was the background music of her childhood, the squelch of mud in boots, the wet cough of a maid dying of consumption, the endless scratching behind tapestry-laden walls. At age 16, she was married off to the Marquise de Brinvilliers, a man with a title, debts, and a fondness for gambling, opium, and other men's wives. Their wedding feast was a display of aristocratic denial. Suckling pigs, sugar sculptures, fountains of wine, and behind the curtains, servants vomiting from spoiled oysters. She wore a dress that weighed more than some of the guests and smiled as her husband's breath soured the air between their vows. Their first night together, he passed out drunk beside her, his lace collar soaked in sweat and his boots still on. He snored like a warhorse. She stared at the cracked ceiling and realized that love, like cleanliness, was a myth reserved for poets. Her marriage brought her freedom of a kind, freedom to drift, to wander salons and gardens and poisoners' quarters. She became fluent in masks. In public, she was witty, charitable, adored. In private, she was quietly furious, slowly rotting in her own way. She visited apothecaries, not for remedies, but for recipes. She attended mass with holy water she privately believed was filth. She cultivated friendships with alchemists and charlatans, men with yellow teeth who taught her which powders made a person sleep and which made them stop breathing altogether. The filth in her life stopped being something she endured. It became something she cultivated. She learned to smile while something died inside her. And no one noticed, not the priests, not her father, not the Parisian elite who toasted her elegance while she watched them through narrowed, calculating eyes. This is how Madame de Brinvilliers began, not as a monster, but as a product of her environment. Groomed in rot, dressed in perfume, raised in a world where cleanliness was a costume and corruption was the air they all breathed. By the time Madame de Brinvilliers turned 25, the salons of Paris had become her personal hunting ground, gilded theaters of hypocrisy, where aristocrats paraded their intellect while sipping from crystal goblets filled with rot. The women dabbed rosewater behind their ears to hide the odor of unwashed hair. The men wore wigs powdered with arsenic, unaware that their vanity was poisoning them slowly. Everything was a masquerade. Cleanliness was a performance. Morality was for the poor. The salons sparkled, but the air was thick with sweat, candle soot, and secrets. This was a world where people talked of virtue while plotting seduction, where laughter drowned out coughs from consumption, and where beauty was painted over boils. And in the middle of it all stood Marie Madeleine, perfectly powdered, perfectly poised. Her hands soft as silk, and her heart blackening by the day. She knew which women were having affairs, which husbands were secretly bankrupt, and which families kept jars of powdered inheritance under their beds. She listened. She smiled. She remembered. It was here, in these perfumed chambers, that she perfected her poison craft, not just with vials and powders, but with words. Her real gift wasn't chemistry, 'twas persuasion. She could make a man feel loved as she poured powdered toadstool into his sherry. She could lull suspicion to sleep with a compliment. The first person to die was a Serventan old cook who had once laughed when she burned her hand. No one cared. Then came the stablemaster, then a cousin, then another. It was too easy. The authorities didn't question death, not among the poor, not among women, not when the cause could always be bad air or melancholy or overexertion. She attended funerals dressed in black silk, her eyes dry, her breath sweetened with violet lozenges. The corpses mounted, and so did her confidence. Each death was a rehearsal. Each goodbye was practice for something bigger. Her targets grew bolder. A rival who insulted her at court. A merchant who refused her credit. A lover who broke her heart. She slipped poison into tarts, into coffee, into love letters. She didn't need knives or screaming or blood. She let people decay from the inside out, just as she had. Meanwhile, her public persona only blossomed. The salons adored her wit. Priests praised her piety. Her father, still alive then, proudly called her his jewel. He had no idea she was already dissolving his legacy, grain by grain. She laughed at his dinners, fed him dainties laced with just enough belladonna to cause confusion, then miraculously nursed him through his illness. She was an angel, everyone said, a devoted daughter, a miracle of femininity. And then he died. His decline was slow and stuttering. His mind went first, then his liver, then his speech. When he finally stopped breathing, she wept convincingly. The doctors blamed old age. The priest blamed God's will. No one blamed her. Why would they? She was a woman. She was delicate. She was incapable. But the truth was that Parisian society, in all its filth and arrogance, had created her. It had marinated her in perfume and poison. It had shown her that appearances mattered more than reality, that virtue was a costume, and that death could be an art form. In this world, morality was for servants and sinners. For the elite, sin was style. She began keeping a little notebook, not of names, but of dosages, of symptoms, of experiments. She made her own poison blends, clever combinations of arsenic, antimony, powdered glass. She tested them on pigeons, on stray dogs, on unwanted guests. She gave her victims time to recover, sometimes just to see what stuck. She once killed a man over 2 weeks and claimed to be shocked when he died. Her favorite method was what she called the kiss of sleep, a blend so subtle that the victim would fall into fatigue, then slowly decline. It looked like overwork. It looked like fate, but it was her hand every time. And it thrilled her. Still, there were moments, flickers of conscience. Perhaps. She confessed to a priest once. She told him everything. But he thought she was dramatizing, making up stories for attention. After all, what woman would kill her own family? What lady would poison a lover? What gentle smile could hide so much hate? He gave her 3 Hail Marys and a blessing. She never confessed again. She threw parties after that. Lavish ones, full of sugar and silver and string quartets. And every guest was a potential corpse. She watched them eat. She watched them flirt. She watched them pretend they weren't miserable. And she understood something crucial. Filth wasn't just physical. It was spiritual. It was emotional. These people were rotting from the inside. Outtanned, she had simply joined the rhythm. As her reputation bloomed, so did the deaths. But by then, Paris had stopped noticing. Death was everywhere. It was common. It was boring. And so was she, by design. No one expected brilliance. No one expected danger, especially not from someone so perfectly ordinary. And so she kept smiling. She kept sipping wine. She kept writing poems. She was planning her greatest acts because death for Madame de Brinvilliers wasn't punishment. It was expression. By the late 1660s, whispers had become rumors, and rumors had grown teeth. Paris, though soaked in its usual rot, had begun to itch with suspicion. Too many bodies, too many coincidences. And for once, the deaths weren't just among the poor or expendable. The aristocracy, those perfumed pillars of pretense, had begun to take notice. A cousin here, a brother-in-law there, all dying in patterns too convenient to ignore. And in the eye of this growing storm, one name quietly resurfaced, again and again. Madame de Brinvilliers. It started, as these things often did, with a lover. She had fallen for a man named Gaudin de Saint, coy, handsome, ambitious, and just as morally bankrupt as she. He wasn't noble, not by blood, but he had enough charm and cruelty to pass. Together, they were a perfect storm of elegance and vice. He refined her techniques, helped her acquire exotic toxins, kept her secrets in little glass vials and iron-locked boxes. But as with all great partnerships rooted in filth, it rotted from the inside. Saint Croix died suddenly in 1672. The cause? Some said natural. Others suspected poison. But irony doesn't knock, it bursts through the door. And in his death, he left behind a private archive of letters, recipes, and damning confessions. The authorities, nosy as ever when it involved noble blood, cracked it open. Inside, among love notes and debt ledgers, they found a trail, and that trail led straight to Madame de Brinvilliers. For years, she had danced between suspicion and status. Now, the music stopped. She fled France, weaving through convents and border towns like a shadow on the run. She wore disguises. She prayed in public. She wept in front of strangers. But her scent clove, camphor, and a faint trace of arsenic lingered. Eventually, in Belgium, she was captured by a clever French spy pretending to be a priest. Her final confession came not in a church, but in a prison cell, laced with fear and filth. Her trial was less about justice and more about spectacle. The court wanted a performance. And she, ever the actress, obliged. She confessed to everything, every murder, every dose, every lie wrapped in lace. But she did it with dignity, or at least the hollow bones of it. She sat upright. She corrected the judges. She described her poison methods like recipes from a cookbook. The crowd was horrified. They were also thrilled. The public devoured her story. The newspapers, the pamphleteers, even the priests couldn't stop talking. Not because they truly mourned her victims, but because they secretly admired her audacity. A woman had turned the tools of the powerful secrecy, seduction, science into weapons, and for that, she had to be destroyed. Her sentence, death, of course, but not quickly. Before her execution, she was subjected to the water torture, a gruesome interrogation method where she was forced to swallow gallon after gallon of water until her body swelled, her lungs strained, and her silence cracked. It was symbolic, really Paris trying to purge its own filth by drowning it. And then came the final act, public beheading. On July 17, 1676, she was paraded through the streets like a fallen empress. The crowd jeered. Some wept. Most just stared, wondering how someone so petite, so composed, could house so much poison. Her dress was simple, her face pale, but her eyes, those eyes, were unrepentant. Even as the executioner raised his blade, she didn't beg. She didn't scream. She simply watched, and when the blade fell, Paris exhaled not in relief, but in reflection. Because Madame de Brinvilliers wasn't an anomaly. She was a symptom, a mirror, a reminder that beneath every powdered wig and velvet sleeve, there was rot. That behind every salon door, something dark festered. And that sometimes, the filthiest thing of all, was the silence. In her death, she became legend. A warning whispered in boarding schools. A name scratched into convent walls. A ghost that haunted noble lineages. But in truth, she was never just a monster. She was Paris. Madame de Brinvilliers was gone, her head severed, her secrets spilled, and her name smeared across the papered salons and piss-soaked cobblestones of Paris. But something strange happened in the wake of her execution. Something ugly. Something distinctly Parisian. The filth didn't fade, it flourished. You might expect that the death of such a woman would cause a moral reckoning, that nobles would look inward, scrub their walls, purge their arsenic cabinets, and rid their lives of the stench of corruption. But this was 17th century France, where rot could be gilded and sin sold by the yard. And so, rather than recoil in horror, the aristocracy did what it always did. It turned scandal into style. Suddenly, poisons were all the rage. Apothecaries found themselves pestered, not by physicians, but by debutantes and dukes asking in hushed voices about certain powders or gentle tinctures for unwanted burdens. Books on toxicology sold briskly. Latin phrases for lethal dose and slow-acting venom entered polite dinner conversation. Even makeup, already a cesspool of lead, mercury, and crushed bugs, was now mixed with whispered rumors of Brinvilliers' beauty secrets. Did she lighten her skin with vinegar? Did she scent her gloves with belladonna? No one knew. Everyone guessed. Fashion took a morbid turn. Mourning black was no longer just for widows. It became a flirtation with death, a nod to danger. Women wore miniature skulls on brooches. Men commissioned portraits in which they posed with apothecary vials beside their family crests. One infamous count even had a ring made in the shape of a hollow tooth said to contain just enough poison to kill a mistress or a rival, or perhaps even himself. Poison, like perfume, had become a matter of taste. But the obsession wasn't limited to surface aesthetics. The paranoia, too, bloomed like mold in a locked cellar. Servants were eyed with suspicion. Cups were tested. Silver spoons were dipped into every dish before noble lips touched a bite. Families broke apart under the weight of whispered accusations. Sons accused fathers. Daughters blamed mothers. In some households, food tasters became fashionable against small, underpaid men with strong stomachs and short lifespans. The art of living in luxury had merged with the fear of dying in agony. And then came the poison panics. The government, ever eager to appear as though it were in control, launched sweeping investigations. They called it the Affair of the Poisons. Between 1677 and 1682, nearly 400 people were arrested. Some were guilty. Most were just guilty of being inconvenient. There were black masses, alleged witches, fake priests, and real alchemists. The most mundane apothecaries found themselves interrogated, tortured, and occasionally executed simply because they knew how to mix herbs. The filth, once contained in shadowy corners, now spread across the court like a fever. Even the King Louis XIV himself was not untouched. His mistress, Madame de Montespan, once the most powerful woman in France, was whispered to have consorted with poisoners and priests of the black arts. Love potions, hexes, fertility rituals, it was all part of the same stew. Louis, ever concerned with appearances, moved swiftly. Trials were hushed. Witnesses disappeared. And the court shifted again, this time toward tighter control and subtler filth. By the 1680s, the panic had largely burned itself out. Officially, the poison cases were closed. The Bastille was quieter. Heads stopped rolling, but the paranoia lingered soft, like the scent of decay under polished wood. And the legacy of Madame de Brinvilliers lived on, not in honor, but in whispers and silk-lined boxes hidden under beds. In some ways, she had become a folk hero, not a noble one, not a saint, but a woman who bent the rules in a world that was built to crush her. Women invoked her name when forced into unwanted marriages. Servants smirked when nobles fretted over stomach cramps. Even centuries later, her story would echo through literature and legend. Alexandre Dumas, Victor Hugo, they all nodded to her in some form. She was too rotten to forget, too fascinating to ignore. And in the grand ballroom of Versailles, where candlelight flickered off marble and filth still clung to velvet, the dance continued. Men toasted to health with trembling hands. Women laughed behind fans, wondering which of them would live to see next season's fashions. Because in Louis XIV's France, the real danger wasn't the enemy at the gate. It was the powder on your gloves, the gloss on your lips, the vial in your ring, the filth behind the facade, and the ghosts in your wine. Filth in Versailles was never just physical. It was layered, perfumed, powdered, and perfectly rehearsed. Chapter by chapter, we've peeled back the gilded layers of the Sun King's court. But now we arrive at the final, most insidious layer, the legacy of rot that Versailles left behind. A legacy not just of silks and scandals, but of institutionalized grime, both bodily and moral, that would linger long after the powdered wigs had been swept into history's dustpan. The court didn't change when Madame de Brinvilliers lost her head. If anything, it refined its filth. It became quieter, slicker, and far more performative. Versailles became a blueprint for every future hall of power that wanted to shine brightly while stinking beneath the surface. Even after Louis XIV's death in 1715, the stink of Versailles, literal and metaphorical, refused to fade. The very architecture of the palace conspired to maintain appearances while harboring rot. Beneath the salons and galleries, the pipes clogged. The stables overflowed. The air hung heavy with sweat, powder, perfume, and excrement. And no matter how many mirrors reflected elegance, they couldn't reflect the truth. Versailles was a beautiful lie built on a swamp of human excess. Foreign visitors wrote home in disbelief. They spoke of splendor, yes, but also fleas, lice, piss puddles, and foul-smelling fountains. Some called it magical, others monstrous. But all agreed, nothing smelled quite like Versailles. Even Voltaire, years later, would write of the aristocratic manure pile with the kind of detached disgust only a Frenchman could refine into poetry. But the true poison of Versailles was cultural. It infected the idea of power itself. It taught generations of monarchs and nobles that image was everything. That cleanliness could be faked with a puff of talc. That reputation was managed with execution and exile. And that filth, if you framed it just right, could be chic. This rot festered not just in France. It traveled. It crept into the courts of Europe, where powdered faces and secret sins flourished like mildew behind painted panels. And when revolution finally came, when the people of France decided they had enough of the stink, the fall of Versailles was more than political. It was olfactory. They stormed the gates not just for bread, but for breath. For a chance to live outside the suffocating lies of perfumed oppression. Even now, Versailles stands. Tourists walk its gleaming halls. They marvel at the mirrors, the chandeliers, the perfectly preserved illusion. They don't smell what once was, but the walls remember. Every crack in the marble, every whisper in the tapestries, carries a trace of what was hidden. The powder masking the pustules, velvet covering the vermin, the elegance wrapped around excrement. In the end, Versailles teaches us a simple truth: that filth, when given enough gold and gossip, can become legacy. That a palace built on piss and poison can still be called beautiful if you light it just right. And that the dirtiest parts of history are often the ones most carefully polished. So the next time you hear the rustle of silk or see a portrait of a nobleman with pristine curls and hollow eyes, remember, beneath that powdered skin, behind those velvet drapes, in the cracks of the marble and the silence of the gardens, filth reigns supreme. And somewhere Madame de Brinvilliers is still smiling. And so ends the tale of Madame de Brinvilliers, a woman soaked in perfume, poison, and putrid disgrace. Her legacy lingers not in marble statues or gilded portraits, but in whispers behind closed doors, and the rotting scent of secrets left too long in the sun. If you thought this was filthy, wait until you meet the next subject. Because in our upcoming episode, we'll journey into the lice-infested boots and boil-covered body of a man who claimed divine authority, but hadn't bathed in months. So if you're still awake, be sure to subscribe, or drift off knowing history will be filthier next time. Until then, stay dirty, sleep easy.